told Al Jazeera that officials from the UN-backed government fled as hundreds of demonstrators forced their way in. Security guards loyal to the Southern Transitional Council were stationed there but didn't try to stop the protesters. Jamal Al-Shayal has more on what triggered the protests.
This protest was triggered by members of the security services that receive their paychecks from the UN-backed government, which has taken Aden as a headquarter ever since the Houthi militia overran essentially the government up in the capital, Sana'a. Now, those security forces haven't been paid, or those personnel haven't been paid their salaries for 9 months now. They started a protest around midday at Bank Square, which is roughly around a kilometer away from the Al-Mashiq Palace, and that then went on to them marching towards the presidential palace and essentially storming it. Interestingly enough, they stormed it with little resistance from the Southern Transitional Government, which is backed by the United Arab Emirates, who were in charge of guarding that presidential palace, and then entered it eventually. Where the ministers are and the Prime Minister, we're not quite sure exactly. However, we do understand from sources on the ground that they weren't inside the palace at the time. There were some government officials there, but none of the ministers or the main statesmen present. Economically speaking, roughly 3 weeks ago, the Saudi-backed government did say that it was going to introduce some sort of stimulus package or something that was going to help those who were struggling economically. That hasn't come to fruition. Obviously, Yemen is a devastated country. Its economy is in tatters. Everything about it has been essentially all but destroyed over the past 4 years because of that Saudi-UAE led war, as well as obviously the actions of the Houthi militia and those that back it.
3 bombs have exploded next to a convoy carrying food to one of Yemen's largest camps for displaced families in Marib. Locals in Hadramaut province in eastern Yemen say homemade devices went off in succession, damaging one of the 26 trucks loaded with aid. No injuries were reported. It's not clear who's behind the attack. The UN Special Envoy to Yemen says the situation has taken a dramatic turn for the worse, especially for children. UN workers are still trying to raise nearly $4 billion to feed millions of people there. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, has more.
This was a very grim assessment of the situation in Yemen. The UN Special Envoy telling the Security Council that it seems the war is back in full force. This is how Martin Griffiths began his speech.
I'm returning to this council yet again to report a deterioration of the conflict in Yemen. And this time, a dramatic one. Nasrallah's offensive on Marib Governorate continues, putting civilians, including an estimated 1 million internally displaced persons, at risk. Fighting forces on both sides have suffered heavy losses in this unnecessary battle. And I see shocking reports, as I'm sure we all do, of children increasingly getting drawn into the war effort and deprived of their future.
He says he's particularly concerned by the Houthis' ongoing offensive on Marib, by the cross-border air attacks, the Houthi drone and missile strikes on Saudi Arabia and the Saudi air raids on Sana'a, and by the fact the war is spreading again to places like Hodeidah and Taiz. Of course, one of the effects of this is humanitarian disaster. The UN is warning of famine in Yemen. They tried to raise money from the international community at the beginning of the month. They wanted 3.85 billion, and yet they only managed to raise 1.7 billion, less than half the money they needed.